Hey everyone, welcome back to this panel discussion on cloud data strategies and best practices. With me, I have David from Teradata, Jon from Manta, and Joe from Qlik. But please introduce yourselves and what you do. David?
Hi, hello everyone. I'm David Jerrim. I run Teradata's enterprise architecture practice in EMEA and spend much of my time talking about cloud migration and cloud data strategies to our customer base.
Excellent. Jon?
Hello, this is Jan from Manta. I'm responsible for research and education over here. So mostly helping market understand the value of data lineage and how to get more out of our metadata that we have.
Excellent. And Joe?
Hi, I'm Joe DosSantos, and I'm the Chief Data Officer at Qlik, and I am responsible for the implementation of our cloud data strategy, among other things, at Qlik, and have been deploying things to the cloud now, moving things for the past year.
Excellent. Let's prompt the discussion a little bit like this, hitting off some of the discussions that I've had earlier in the day today. I think there are a lot of technologies that spur on management trends in terms of how we manage cloud data and that kind of thing. And a lot of tools now are getting more and more capable and thus overlapping with each other a lot. Qlik is gaining capabilities that are sort of encroaching on what other tools that are perhaps not so user-centric have been doing before. And Teradata is doing a lot of work that is very user-facing. And so all these tools are really growing and overlapping with each other. I'm interested to hear from each of you where you think the data strategy where the root of the data strategy is in terms of technology. Is it in master data management? Is it in the business tools? Is it in the data science? Is it in the research? So what is the root and foundation of a data strategy from a technology perspective? And very soon we'll get into the organizational perspective. So David, why don't you hit it off? What's your opinion on that?
Yeah, I think the key thing to remember with any sort of technology or data strategy activity is that you need to focus on the outcome. What are you trying to achieve? And from a technology perspective, with many organizations right now, the words we frequently hear about are agility and flexibility and scalability. And I think there's a significant move now in many organizations to actually federate out a lot of those technology responsibilities into business teams. And that means that your technology must be easy to consume, easy to understand, and more importantly, you must be able to deploy it at scale, right? If you've got lots of users trying to use your technology, then you've obviously got to have the performance and scalability to support all those individual end users.
I think we're going to put a pin in that ability to federate technologies and get back to that, because that seems to be a recurring theme here. What would you say, Jon, about central technology to data strategies? Is it technology that's spurring on changes in cloud data strategies, would you say? Or is it much the same?
Sorry. Yeah, I would definitely agree with that. But from maybe a broader perspective, I believe that the key thing here is that as we are starting the cloud journey, we should definitely learn from the mistakes and experiences that we've made with the on-premise, and make sure that we transfer the best practices that we applied on-prem to cloud. Because in the end, if you have database on-prem or in cloud, you still need to make sure that you're approaching it correctly, that you're managing it correctly, that you're managing the metadata correctly and efficiently. So from my perspective, the key aspect here is to make sure that we manage especially the metadata around these cloud sources very tightly, and ideally in an automated way as the premise to actually deploy the new technology, whatever it is in the end, instead of dealing with the metadata and this additional information as an afterthought.
All right, metadata management, that's super interesting. So we have accessibility, metadata management, and what about you, Joe? What would you say is a central driving technological force?
Well, maybe we should start with the kind of centers of gravity in an organization. I like what David said around like data is kind of boring to most people. It's the use cases, it's the outcomes, the analytics, it's the action that's driven this. As a consequence of that, you have kind of this idea, this kind of growing capability around data science, around machine learning, around app embedded things that starts to really kind of capitalize on that. And there's a really important a sense of imagination that's required, that you have to start to get your business on board to kind of understand and imagine what's even possible there. Now, what that happens is, you know, if you kind of think about it in the 21st century, if we're all running the same math and the same algorithms, the difference between who's going to be great and who's going to be exceptional is the data that you have, which really starts to create the second center of gravity, which is around how do I administer and broker and catalog and organize all that data so that someone can be really productive in that analytics context. So as a consequence, cloud is really driving both of those. It's enabling us, first of all, to be able to really consume and do science problems and do calculations that were not previously possible. But more importantly, it's allowing us to churn through data and understand the nature of that data in the cloud as well. So I think those two things go hand in hand, and one without the other is kind of like a sandwich without bread.
Right, that makes sense. So it's evident that the cloud is introducing a number of new capabilities that weren't there before, in my opinion. And it's not necessarily just a lift and shift, so to speak. We'll get back to that in a moment, but there is a recurring theme, even in the things that you've all said here, in terms of the responsibility it places on an organization that wants to have a cloud data strategy, which is to govern it appropriately. And the question is, you know, now that people are being spurred to experiment and do things, you know, you might not be able to access a database directly. You would want to do it through a master data management system, through change requests and all of that kind of thing. Where is the sweet spot between having an extremely strong data governance strategy and the overhead that that brings with it, and allowing for experimentation with the data that you're trying to make available and that you're trying to federate? David, what would you say?
Well, I think too many people view governance as a significant overhead, and it's all about control and stopping people do things. But I tend to view governance really as if you get the right processes and principles in place, actually it's all about enabling people to do things and to do the things that they want, whilst at the same time, you know, secure the corporate assets as you need to. So I think it's multi-layered here, and you know we've talked about agility and so on, and being able to exploit data, and I think without governance, you know, many organizations are just going to have this explosion of unmanaged, ungoverned data. So it's important to strike the balance between the freedom to innovate and explore, but also the ability to secure and govern from a broader corporate perspective. And many customers today in regulated industries, banking and healthcare and so on, the governance is critical for them in their day-to-day operations. So I think it's all about striking the balance.
I don't think anybody would be surprised if we were to say that a majority of people feel that governance is more a hindrance than an aid in accelerating innovation. Jan, what would you say, you know, from the lessons that we've learned with governance on-prem, what would be the things that you would want to keep or change when you're adopting a cloud data strategy?
I definitely couldn't agree more with David, because that's exactly the view that a lot of customers actually have. If you talk to data engineers, data scientists, they really struggle with actually getting the additional information, the context for the data that they are working with, right? And last few years with big data introduction, that only made the situation somewhat worse, right? So with cloud, the idea is not to repeat that and to really think of governance as a way to really enable us, as David said. From our perspective, or from my perspective, the key aspect here is to basically deliver data and manage data as a product, which means not just provide the raw data sets or somehow adjusted or cleansed data sets, but to provide the context, to provide the metadata around it, to understand where is the data coming from, what does it mean? How is it used? Who does it actually use outside of my particular project, right? All of this information is really key to make sure that we actually remain flexible and that the cloud strategy that we're implementing will actually deliver what we expect it to deliver, which is definitely flexibility, scalability, and not just from technical perspective, but also from the process perspective, so that we can truly access data faster, whether it's through some sort of centralized platform, master data management. It really depends on the actual use case, whether we truly need raw data or whether we actually need, in many cases, as in the financial sector, somehow cleansed and certified data sets that we wanna work with.
I think there have existed tools for things like data lineage and other kinds of metadata management to provide the kinds of services that you're describing in big data platforms in the past, although now perhaps they are more cloud native and exist as services. Joe, my intuition is that the want to provide the flexibility for users to do things and the need for having data governance and having everything defined centrally, perhaps from a center of excellence, are in a sense orthogonal to each other. How is that best managed, or how should it be managed in practice?
Well, they are, and they aren't. So I want to pick up on one of Jan's themes here, which is about, the idea of not using governance as a restriction, but as an enablement, right? So if you kind of start to think about your experience in a store, if you were to walk into a store, you want the things to be available to you on the shelves. You want to know what you have access to. You want to know what's in stock. You want to know what you don't have access to. And every day in our lives, we have restrictions on certain things that we can and can't buy, from tobacco to alcohol, from other things. That's governance. We don't think, oh, the bureaucracy, I don't understand. What, can I buy it or can I not? The governance makes things easy for us to access the things that we're looking for. And I think that's the thing that we need to start to think about, is governance as an enabler in a world in which, again, you're going to win by getting better data faster. And if you get that data faster, then you're going to win. Governance becomes essential to that. Now, one of the things I think is unique about the cloud is, let's take a look for a second at how we control data and how we have for the past 20 years. If we were having this conversation in 2000, we would be talking about our data warehouse, our marts, and these end users that had limited access to these marts, right? There were 50 fields, and the raw data, don't worry about it. We're just going to control that. And then big data came along, and we had no idea what was in these lakes. We had no idea. We're trying desperately to go around and tag, and everybody just kind of put up firewalls and hoped for the best. Like, oh, you'll have a data loss prevention strategy. You can't do that in the cloud. You don't know who's out there. So it's created this real need for discipline and tagging and organization that Jan's talking about. And that, by the way, is the exact same thing that allows us to think offensively about the shopping experience for data. And I think that has really kind of almost accidentally stumbled us into this age where governance is an enabler as opposed to a constraint.
So many of these tools make it, like you say, much easier nowadays to adopt best practices in data governance. Whereas before they were nice to have technologies, now they're a very integral part of the actual data management workflow in the cloud. And to that effect, I do think that some of the cloud providers differ in the types of services that they provide. So in terms of your products, both Teradata and Qlik, and also Jan from Manta, I'm curious to hear a little bit what your experiences are across the different cloud vendors. David, do you differentiate between Azure, AWS, and Google Cloud in any ways?
From a Teradata perspective, we don't. We utilize what you could call sort of base cloud provider services, so virtual machines, object storage, block storage, and so on. And so from our perspective, really, it's an integration play. So we have to make sure we can ingest data via the cloud provider, data management tools, and so on, and exploit data, via querying, reporting, analytical tools. I would say, from my perspective, if you were choosing a cloud provider, AWS is the most established, the richest provider, and probably innovates faster than some of the others. Google obviously has some strength in its machine learning, data science type capabilities, and Azure has the advantage of they've been in the corporate data centers on-prem, and there's a relatively straightforward migration path from some of the Microsoft technologies. I think as a developer, the experience varies between the platforms, but when you think about how modern applications are built in the cloud, it's composing together, orchestrating the various cloud provider services, and you can do pretty much the same in any of the cloud providers right now.
I suppose there's a bit of overlap between what Teradata provides in terms of data management and what some of the native cloud services are, and from that perspective, I think does it make sense then that from Teradata's perspective, they're all equivalent, given that you provide many of those services?
Absolutely, and I think the interesting aspect here as well is that we obviously have customers, using technologies like Qlik and other established, data management ETL tools in the on-premise environment. When you look at the maturity of some of those cloud native capabilities, then as a consumer of those services, you're going to have to do an evaluation, because I think one of my observations would be that the established third-party software providers typically have a high level of maturity in some of their capabilities than you would with some of the cloud native services. So I think that's an important distinguishing factor. Before you go all in with a single cloud vendor, take a long hard look at the capabilities that you're using right now. Is things like master data management capabilities within your favorite ETL tool like Informatica or DataStage. How does that compare to some of the cloud native tooling, and likewise on your slice and dice reporting and data science workbenches and things?
Right. Yeah, and I mean, you are pushing pretty heavily here on the significance of metadata management, and I think like we just said, the cloud vendors are promoting their integrated versions of these tools, sometimes incompatible with each other, sometimes more or less compatible. What's your experience with the differentiation between the cloud providers and their maturity with respect to some of these tools that are necessary? Are they sufficient?
I think they're at some of the perhaps the lower level of maturity, which is why that you've got such a rich alternative ecosystem of third-party software in this space. There's some basic capabilities in some of the cloud providers, such as some of the basic lineage and tracking, and perhaps in Glue isn't going to match some of the capabilities that have been perhaps in some of the more established tools right now, and from a Teradata perspective, right, we've got to integrate with all of them and give you that choice as a consumer, being able to combine those technologies together. Yeah,
Jan, what would you say?
Yeah, I have to agree with David a lot, because definitely there are some capabilities. As David said, in many cases, they are not that mature as we would need them for the automated use. But at the same time, in many cases, these capabilities are centered around that particular cloud provider, whether it's Google, whether it's Azure, Microsoft, whether it's AWS. So it's sort of limited to that particular scope of what they are dealing with, or to their platform. But the customers that we actually have, that we all have, are having the on-premise platforms. They may not be in a single cloud only. In some cases, they are using even independent cloud providers for specific services, whether it's reporting, whether it's storage, and so on. So in many cases, we see that there's actually a huge need to actually complement those built-in services with additional layer that actually provides the information from the outside, from the legacy world, from other providers, and so on. And then to add to it from a different angle, the big change that we are seeing and that we have been seeing for quite some time is actually a move more towards coding, like coding in Python using Spark technologies, things like that. Mm-hmm. And when you actually have something built, coded using programming language like Python or Scala, in many cases, the metadata information or lineage information is very much buried in the code. So you still need some platform or capability to extract that lineage and metadata information even from there without doing it manually. You need an automated solution to really be able to deliver the value that you expect from the cloud.
Right. Joe, in many places where Qlik is installed, up until now, we've been talking about the cloud providers as if they were a sort of abstract hosting environment, but in many cases, there are sort of vendor-specific services that are being used in these clouds, whether it be Google's Office suite or Microsoft's Office suite, and in AWS, presumably somebody might be using many of their database services together with other database services. How do you see sort of the reasoning that somebody should be doing when it comes to data strategy with respect to the maturity of the tools that are provided by these vendors? Obviously, Qlik provides a lot of added value. So,
well, I want to pick up on Jan's theme about coding. All software companies, all companies have a heritage, a place that they come from. Microsoft's heritage is the business user. If you can use Excel, you can use the platform, the tools in their platform, right? So it's really anchored around this idea of simplicity. Now, simplicity you start to kind of wane out as soon as you start to get into the complexity arena. Google was kind of on the opposite end. It was kind of on the everybody's a coder and everybody's going to be doing these things, but more for the individual, right? So the hardcore coder and kind of the actual, think about you've got a Gmail account, this kind of idea, hardcore capabilities for the individual. And AWS was kind of, its heritage was the coder that was in a corporate setting, right? So you've got these kind of heritages, and that starts to color the offerings. Now, obviously, those offerings are starting to come closer together, but with respect to where they're most matured in their respective places, it's anchored around their heritage. So if you're looking for something that's a hardcore enterprise machine learning tool that can be scaled, that's AWS's heritage. Whereas if you're looking for something that's going to be simple and easy to deploy, that's not code friendly, that's Microsoft's heritage, right? So eventually we're all coming together. And I agree that David's point around the platforms, at the end of the day, a platform is a platform. And they're kind of interchangeable. And what's starting to happen is that each of the different cloud providers is starting to try and get in each other's space, as is normal. But that, I would say, that's kind of where they are right now, is that the hardcore individual coder likes the feel of Google. The coder in an enterprise setting likes the feel of AWS. And those who are kind of business oriented and want something for simplicity's sake are really focused on the Microsoft ecosystem. And of course, things change very quickly.
Right. Well, I think there's been a push for services that seem to follow trends, but always with vendor added value, whether that is message queuing services or the versions of Kubernetes or the versions of PostgreSQL that are provided by these vendors. I'm going to shift a little bit laterally here and talk about Kubernetes and what it enables companies to do in terms of abstracting their services. David, I'd like to hear your thoughts a little bit on what you think Kubernetes really offers in terms of platform agnosticity or not. Is that Teradata? Is that something that meshes with Teradata's offerings, and how does it really relate to the offerings provided by the different cloud vendors?
Yeah, Kubernetes is interesting, right? There's a shift in many organizations right now from moving to a build rather than buy, right? For many years, people have been buying off-the-shelf software that has issues around potentially around capability and agility. So the rise of microservice type architectures allowing us to decompose some of those larger monolithic environments into microservice and containers is something that's definitely a thing right now. I think from a Teradata perspective, you're going to see some product capability from us in this space, but on the whole, from a data analytics perspective, Kubernetes is great from a model deployment perspective, putting API endpoints on top of those model scoring and so on, and then being able to tear them down and reinstantiate them as your model changes is pretty much essential to many digital transformation programs these days. So you get that flexibility of deployment, but for many customers, it's not going to be in their sweet spot, right? They're going to want to utilize some of those cloud native services rather than perhaps invest in a hand coding type capability within their lines of business. So I think Kubernetes absolutely has a place, but I think that's a corporate strategy decision there in terms of, do they want to be a tech company or do they want to focus on customer experience and in using cloud native services?
Jan, what would you say? Is Kubernetes becoming the de facto platform? Does it actually make the cloud vendors equivalent, or is Kubernetes just another place for data scientists to host their toys?
Yeah, this is definitely a tough one. From the way I'm looking at it is that Kubernetes is a platform that allows an easier, more automated deployment and basically decouples the hardware or even software like operating system from deployment of the particular technology. So we see actually with many of our customers interest in Kubernetized or containerized deployment. When they are still managing their internal infrastructure, they in many cases want to keep it that way. And Kubernetes is a way how to make it more efficient and easier to manage for the future. They still are following even the cloud strategy, but they are basically keeping both sort of on the same level to keep Kubernetes primarily for the on-prem that are hosted internally and cloud for the cloud services. So from my perspective, I don't see them as one or the other, but they can very well coexist in the same environment.
I think it's being driven by a lot of organizations that are very strong at development internally in the organization. So that develop a lot of products internally and then deploy them all. And those large organizations can afford to make demands of other third-party software to be able to run on that platform. So I'm wondering, is this going to stay a developer platform? And then for other software, we're going to have the platform as a service or software as a service capabilities offered by the cloud providers? Or is everything actually moving toward Kubernetes? What is your sense of that, Joe?
Well, I really like what David said around kind of the audience of how Kubernetes is attractive to what kind of community. The developer community it's not the developer so much in a company, it's the nature of the company itself. So I think that 5 years ago we had this idea that Kubernetes and Docker would just be ubiquitous and that everyone would be developing their software in that. And there just aren't enough skills in the marketplace. It's not standard enough. And so as a consequence, what happened is that people just kind of got overwhelmed by it. So if you are a large institution that thinks about technology as its primary form of differentiation. By the way, that doesn't mean you're necessarily a software company. You could be a bank, right? So there's a lot of banks that are really hardcore technology organizations. That's probably 10% of organizations, right? So at the end of the day, I think that most companies don't want to build things in Kubernetes. They want to use things in the cloud. They want to actually go into their work days and they want to go into their Salesforce and they want to just have the things work. They don't even want to spell Kubernetes, right? So what we're really talking about is the language that the developer community is using together. And on that point, absolutely yes, there is currently a standard in Docker and Kubernetes in terms of the ability to deploy things simply into any cloud environment, right? So there's kind of a basic agreement now that there are standards that if you are going to be a software vendor that's going to operate in these ecosystems, if you're going to be a technology creator into these ecosystems, it better be Dockerized, containerized, it better be Kubernetes enabled for sure.
All right, so it seems like the future is Kubernetes. Well, we'll see how that turns out. And I think we're all convinced among the four of us that the future is the cloud. But And the question is to what degree it will be. I don't think anybody is under the impression that on-premise stuff will disappear entirely, but if we believe that AI and data-driven decision-making is going to be very central to organizations, and that perhaps the compute amount required for that is something that one would only be able to rationalize running on the cloud, where does that leave on-prem jobs? Is there, what is the significance of hosting things on-prem after that? What would you say, David?
I think on-prem you'll see remain things like, you know, a lot of organizations still have mainframes in their data centers, so that's always a challenge. How do you break down that capability and integrate that into the cloud? And I think there's always good legal and government type regulations that means that on-prem you know, is going to be a thing for many customers, especially sort of, you know, regulated industries and government type organizations. You know, that's always still going to be the first choice for you. So I think over time most organizations will probably leverage cloud capabilities as much as they can, but what remains on site will be security focused type infrastructure, perhaps legacy infrastructure that doesn't have a natural cloud migration path, and so on. And ultimately, if you're still into a CapEx type purchasing model, that still makes sense for on-premise. Obviously, cloud is more of an OpEx model. So there's some, you know, financing shifts there that organizations need to think about as well.
So a company that's considering going a big digitalization or starting a big digitalization project now, Jan, is there any sense in doing that on-prem? What are the pros and cons?
Yeah, definitely the push that we've seen in the recent years is definitely to go for cloud as much as possible. It definitely is great in scalability, right? You can start really small and grow only as you need and in the pace that you need. You can do that immediately, right? You do not need to sign a large contract or plan properly that much in advance, right? So that's definitely a huge advantage. And at the same time, we see that in case of the legacy, the migration is typically too expensive to be done just to get into the cloud on its own without any additional business value, right? So typically in these cases, there's like a large initiative, as you said, basically digital transformation that actually helps to find additional value, why we actually want to get into cloud and why we want to, what additional value do we want to get out of the migration. Other than that, I don't know, it's always hard to make predictions about what's going to happen, and definitely cloud seems to be the way to go. But at the same time, I agree with David that things like security may be areas where we will still see on-prem type of deployments.
Joe, one of the reasons that cloud providers said that it was very good to run things on the cloud is because you only pay for what you use, or you can scale as your requirements go up and go down. I know for myself, when I run experiments that require GPUs, a lot of times, if it's a project that's going to be ongoing, I need to make the calculation and see how much am I actually going to be using this. And there are still cases where it makes sense to purchase that hardware if the utilization is of a certain amount. Are those calculations still relevant for all facets of cloud data strategies, or would you say that they're shrinking and that right now you more have to argue for on-prem than not?
So I like your point there. So, you know, at the end of the day, we all have a choice to lease our car or to buy our car. And most people say, buy your car. Why would you lease it? That's expensive. It's like renting a car. You're going to pay more over long term, right? And yet that's exactly what we're talking about, to your point. We're talking about consumption-based models. We want to lease our servers. Effectively, that's what working in the cloud is, to David's point around OpEx budget. Now, the reality is that most of us would trade that for the headache of managing a data center, right? Data center management is complex. It's expensive, it consumes a massive amount of energy to cool, and it requires lots of skills that frankly are not core to your mission. And so as a consequence, that's usually a good trade-off. So, but if you are a gigantic institution that has 100% utilization or high utilization of your hardware, that's certainly a factor. What I think is probably more a factor is we're getting to the point now where people who argue that cloud isn't secure enough for their workloads are clearly not paying attention. Right, so I spoke to a CDO recently who had a ransomware attack, and the only data that was safe was the data in the cloud. Right, so it's not so much that there's a safety concern. I think that Jan's point around the cost of migration is really the key consideration. We don't all have the fanciest phones or the fanciest cars. It's costly. We're not talking about a couple of systems. Financial institutions have tens of thousands of applications in some cases, and getting those over is very complex. And I really like Jan's point about what is the use case? What is the thing that we're trying to do? And I think that if we can start to figure out a use case that drives value for an end user point that consumes some analytics, you can take that little chunk and start to bite it off in different chunks. And I think that's how the cloud migration will happen. But to David's point, mainframes are alive and well. So that whole client server thing never stuck for some of them. So you know, it's gonna take us a long time to get this migration, and we're gonna have a long time where people are gonna be in a multiple state with different kinds of technology stacks as they try to migrate to something more modern.
All right. I mean, you touched on a topic that's that I have stumbled upon, unfortunately, many times, which centers on convincing people the pros and cons with respect to security of the cloud and perhaps legality of things. And sometimes it's not so much a matter of whether something is legal or not, or secure or not, but whether we should be spending time rationalizing to what degree it is and how that aligns with our company values and our strategy and that kind of thing. So I'd like to invite you all to sort of conclude, give some concluding remarks and reason about how to approach that discussion of rationalization of expanding your data strategy in the cloud. Please. David.
So from my perspective, I think it's all about the outcomes. So understand what outcomes you need to drive to take your business forward, what aspects you're trying to re-engineer, and in many cases, from my perspective, that the migration is going to be well worth the effort. You need to balance that with short-term business objectives such as being cloud native or cloud first, cloud focused, and so on. So there may be things that you just have to lift and shift. But I think to Joe's previous point here, that there's a cost of the migration in terms of monetary terms, but think about the impact on your business, right? Because you're probably not going to be having the people to invest in your existing on-premises environment as you do the migration. So you might be in a situation where you're effectively standing still for 12 or 18 months as you do some of those more complex migrations. So I think it's all about the bang for the buck, identifying where the value is going to be for you, and then executing effectively and making sure you deliver on those business outcomes that you're so keen to get.
Right. Jan, what would you say, and how do you approach those discussions about cloud security, cloud maturity, and legality, and all those things as you consider to what degree you want to accelerate or adopt a cloud data strategy?
Yeah, definitely start with the end goal. Why are we doing it? What are we expecting? And from there, learn from the past. So we know that the legality or nowadays even ethical use of data, right, is something that is more and more important. So when you're migrating to cloud, build it into the strategy that you have all this information available on hand as part of the design, not as an afterthought, so that when you need to use it, when you need to follow it, you have it available. The truth is that our environments with or without cloud are constantly getting more and more complex, right? We're analyzing more data, we're collecting more data. And with that, we just need to be ready that the next thing that we do, whether it's cloud migration or anything else, machine learning, that we are not creating any sort of Pandora's box that will actually surprise us later, and we'll have to deal with it. So we need to stay flexible and make sure that the environment that we actually built supports us in.
Understood. Joe, I'd like to hear, are these challenges that can be overcome, or are they actual challenges? Security, maturity, and all of those facets of the cloud.
No, absolutely. So, one of the things, I think most of us are in this recovery period where we're recovering from Hadoop, where we tried to make it work and we tried to do it and everything was custom built and we were recreating everything. And we were dealing with these ideas that it was immature, but it was promising, right? That's not what we're talking about here. I mean, most cloud platforms are decidedly more mature than anything we're going to actually build ourselves, right? So really what you're talking about is it's not a maturity problem. It's not a security problem. It's just a way of trying to figure out how you're going to adopt those things. So I think that the key winning argument is quite simply, is that the business that we want to be in? Do we want to be in the hardware business? Do we want to be in the software business? Do we want to have resources? We're going to hire FTEs to do work. What do we want them to do? Generally speaking, it's not administering servers. It's not administering these kinds of platforms. It's doing the work on those platforms. So increasingly, I think that's going to be where the winning argument is. And I really do think that it's important for people to know that it's not about maturity. We really are in a place right now where the commercial software vendor is now officially in the cloud, right? Most of us do our timesheets in the cloud. Most of us do our CRM in the cloud, our financial systems in the cloud. So there's not really much. Many people are actually bringing data from their cloud environments to their on-prem environments. Does that seem logical? So the excuses are gone. Now it's just a question of getting the right skills to be able to adopt it. Do you have the right governance framework in place? Do you have the right security automation in place? Do you have the capability, and do you have the use case? Because other than that, there's not really much that is going to be an obstacle to anything new. And now the question will be, how does it work with the rest? And I know I can't overstate that enough. The idea is whatever one builds, we're talking as if we're kind of in a green field. Hardly any of us are in a green field. We have all these systems and all these applications, and what we need to do is to do something in the cloud that makes those things incrementally better to use. We're not exactly going to rip out an ATM network because it should move from a mainframe to a cloud, right? We could, but it's prohibitively expensive, dangerous, and risky, right? So what is the thing that we can do that adds value without risking the back-end systems in a way that drives some incrementally revenue or risk reduction, et cetera?
Excellent. I think you really wrapped that up well, Joe. It's my opinion as well that the cloud is tremendously mature, and I'm glad to hear that all of you have found that deploying your solutions on the cloud is a pleasant experience, to say the least. All right. Thanks, everyone, for joining the panel today, and to all the viewers, we will be seeing you again shortly.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.